statement of his cannot be taken at face value. Because what are those 5 conditions? And let's see if they accept, or we can accept them to differ and vary, and the hadith still remains as authentic. طيب. One of them is being what? اتصال السند, that the chain is fully connected. If we say that the chain being connected can vary and the hadith still remains authentic, this means what? The chain of narration can be broken and the hadith still remains authentic. Is that correct? No. If the chain is missing a person, if there's a missing link, khalas, it automatically becomes what? Weak, da'if. Okay, even if one person is missing. If one of the narrators is not someone who we can trust their narration, yani their integrity is in question, their honesty is in question, we say it differs, it varies, and it can still be sahih, we can't trust them, so we leave off the narration. Or if the hadith has an abnormality, or if it has a hidden defect, can we say it varies in rank according to how serious it is? It can still be authentic. If it contains any of those, then the hadith is no longer authentic, which means we're left with only one condition, which it's possible that the ranking or the variation is acceptable and the hadith can still remain authentic. Which one is that? We have not mentioned. Tam al-dabt, the memorization of the narrator. This is the only one that we can look at and we can say it's of varying degrees and the hadith is still acceptable. Okay? Because people are not going to be at the same level of memorization. Everyone still has to be trustworthy. The chain still needs to be connected. It still needs to be free of abnormalities and hidden defects. But if someone is at a memorization level of 95% and another is at 90%, are they still both acceptable? Yes. We can accept some levels of variation here. All right. So this is what he means here, and not necessarily that all the other conditions we can accept variations in them. All right. Then he goes on to say, وَمِن ثَمَّ, as a result of that, قُدِّمَ صَحِيحُ الْبُخَارِ ثُمَّ مُسْلِمٍ ثُمَّ شَرْطُهُمَا. As a result of this varying, Bukhari was given preference, then Muslim, then that which is upon their conditions. Okay? The scholars, seeing that not all Sahih Ahadith are at the same level, they gave preference to certain works or compilations over others. Okay? Ibn Ḥajar here, he takes the view, okay, as in his Sharh in Nukhbat al-Fikar, Nuzhat al-Nadar, he mentions that the preference is given first to the Kitab Sahih al-Bukhari. Okay? The narrators that he used in his kitab are at the top of sihha, of authenticity. When it comes to their memorization, they're the best of the best. Then comes Sahih Muslim. Okay? Then what's upon their conditions? What does it mean, what's upon their conditions? What's meant is those same narrators that you will find in Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, but the hadith is found outside of those two books, then it's upon the conditions of those two books, even though it's not mentioned in it. I'll give you an example. We find often in Sahih Muslim a chain of narration which he uses from the narrator of al-Ala ibn Abdurrahman, from his father, from Abu Hurairah. This is the chain of transmission you will often find in Sahih Muslim. Now when you go to another book, for example, Abu Dawood, you'll find that he presents a hadith also with the same chain, same path. But this hadith, this wording, you will not find in Sahih Muslim. But the narrators are the same. So we say that this chain or these people that are found in Sunan Abi Dawud, they are what? Ala sharti Muslim. They are upon the condition of Sahih Muslim, even though they're not found in that book. Okay, the actual hadith. So we said that some of the rankings, and this is one of the ways of ranking or looking at it, Ibn Ḥajar, he presents to us, number one is Sahih Bukhari, then Sahih Muslim, then whatever comes after that upon their conditions. All right, this is the ranking that he gives us here. He says, فَإِنْ خَفَّ الضَّبْطُ فَالْحَسَنُ لِذَاتِهِ وَبِكَثْرَةِ طُرُقِهِ يُصَحَّحُ أو يُصَحَّحُ. If the accuracy decreases, then it is the Hasan in and of itself reports. حَسَنُ لِذَاتِهِ. And with multiple paths, it is considered Sahih. Okay, so here, pay close attention. Hafidh Ibn Ḥajar, al-Asqalānī rahimahullah, he didn't say that if the conditions of authenticity decrease. He's only looking at one condition here, and that is which one? Again, the dabt of the narrator. Okay, the memorization skill of the narrator. This is the only one we're looking at right now. If there is a slight decrease in the memorization of the narrator, then the hadith, we now determine it to be what? Hasan. It dropped from Sahih now to Hasan. Okay, so now we're no longer looking at a A grade narrator. We're now looking at a B grade. Every other condition still remains. Chain is connected. There's no irregularities. There's no hidden defect. The person or persons in the chain are trustworthy. The only thing that has changed now is that the memorization is a little lower. So that is what changes a hadith from going from Sahih in and of its own self to now Hasan in and of its own self. So we understand the difference. Does that make sense? طيب. Okay. So now we're looking at the hadith that is called Hasan lidatihi. All the conditions are there except that one has slightly dropped. Okay. And then he says that this hadith also can be raised up to Sahih, the Hasan hadith. Okay. It has dropped to Hasan, but now it can be raised up to Sahih. How so? He says, وَبِكَثْرَةِ طُرُقِهِ يُصَحَّحُ. When this hadith, that is Hasan, we find the same narration coming through other paths. Other people are narrating this also. Other narrators are coming with the same thing. Then it shows us that this person, although their memory is a bit lower, that this narration, there's no issue with it. They are 100% correct in it. Why? Because you have 3 others, 4 others, 5 others who are saying the same thing. So in this case, his hadith now goes back up to what? Sahih. But is it Sahih in and of its own self? Or is it Sahih due to external factors? It's Sahih due to something external. So this one is called Sahih lighayrihi. Sahih due to other support. All right, due to other support. So now we have 3 types of ahadith which are acceptable that we've mentioned. Last night, we mentioned Sahih lidatihi. In and of its own self, it is authentic. And now we've mentioned Hasan lidatihi, when the memorization drops just a little bit. And when there's additional paths for that hadith, then it comes back up to Sahih, but lighayrihi, due to an external support. Everyone with me so far? Huh? طيب. All right. He goes on to say, فَإِن جُمِعَ فَلِلْتَرَدُّدِ فِي النَّاقِلِ حَيْثُ التَّفَرُّدُ وَإِلَّا فَبِاعْتِبَارِ إِسْنَادٍ. If the grading is made up of, if it's composite of Hasan and Sahih, then it is either due to the indecision regarding the reporter when the report is unique, yani fard, or it is otherwise due to the examination of 2 chains. Like, what does this mean? You have 2 terms, 2 muṣṭalaḥat, Sahih and Hasan. Do these terms ever come together to grade one hadith? To describe one hadith? The answer to that is yes. Okay? The answer to that is yes. And this is often used by Imām al-Tirmidhi in his Jami'. Yani he'll come across a hadith and he'll say about the hadith, this hadith is Hasanun Sahih. This hadith is Hasan Sahih. All right? Describing one hadith. How is there 2 rulings of authenticity on a singular hadith? Okay, this is problematic because we just mentioned what makes a hadith Hasan. And we've also mentioned what makes a hadith sahih. And they both can't be at the same time. Because for a hadith to be hasan, it means it's not what? Sahih. And for a hadith to be sahih, it means it's not hasan. All right? So how is it that two gradings can be used on the same single hadith? Here, Ibn Ḥajar, he attempts to give his answer to this problematic issue. And he gives two ways of explaining this. Okay? Two ways or two answers of explaining this. He says, number one, that the hadith, it comes only through one chain. It comes through only one chain. And there's a difference of opinion on that hadith. Some scholars, they say it's hasan, and some say it's sahih. And so that's why Imam al-Tirmidhi will say something like, this hadith is hasan sahih. Hinting towards what? That there is a difference of opinion. Okay? And one group of scholars takes this while the other takes the other. This is one way of explaining it according to Ibn Ḥajar. And then the second way is to say that this hadith, it comes through two different paths, two different chains. And that each grading is applicable to each path. Meaning this path is hasan and this path is sahih. So it comes from two paths, and that's why he's saying hasan sahih. But both of these explanations are not safe from criticism. Both of these explanations have some issues with them. Okay? What are those issues? Let us look at them together. If we look at the first possible answer, that the hadith, it comes through only one chain, and that there's a difference of opinion, well, just about every time that Imam al-Tirmidhi, he grades a hadith, saying, هذا حديث حسن صحيح, we find that that hadith is muttafaqun alayh, agreed upon its authenticity. There's no difference of opinion of it being hasan or sahih. It's usually sahih. So there's no difference of opinion. So we cannot accept that explanation of Ibn Ḥajar, that there's a difference of opinion. All right? As for the second explanation, to say that each one comes from a separate chain, and that one is hasan and one is sahih, this too doesn't hold. Okay? Why? Because if you go to the Jami' of Imam al-Tirmidhi and you look at, for example, the hadith of Umar, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, verily actions are judged by their intentions. We mentioned that this hadith comes from how many chains, or through how many chains? One, bas. Yet he still grades it by saying hasanun sahih. So we cannot say it comes through two different chains. One is hasan, one is sahih. Because we have examples of ahadith that come through one solitary path. Yet he grades it with that phrase. So both explanations of Ibn Ḥajar do not necessarily hold up. So then how do we explain this? How do we come to the correct conclusion? That the way we solve it is by understanding what does the term hasan mean to Imam al-Tirmidhi to begin with. Remember, yesterday we said, when it comes to muṣṭalaḥat, the technical terms, we need to understand the definition according to the person who's using it. We need to understand what they intend by it, and not what we think of it to be. So it's important to know first what Imam al-Tirmidhi means by the phrase. Then we can go forward in trying to understand why he's ruling upon a hadith with this phrase. Imam al-Tirmidhi, when he says hasan, he means something completely different from what we have explained so far. And he defines it himself in his own jami'. When it comes to a hasan hadith, Imam al-Tirmidhi, he means by it a hadith that has met three conditions. Number one, that it is a hadith which does not contain in it any narrator who is accused of lying, who's been accused of lying. Number two, that the hadith, it comes from more than one path. That the hadith, it comes from more the one path. And number three, the hadith is not shadh. It's not opposed by something stronger. When these three criteria are met, then Imam al-Tirmidhi rules upon a hadith with being hasan. All right? So this is important to understand first before moving forward. Fadl.
And then when you said in the Ahmad bin Yasir came from one chain, but he was hasan for that.
Correct. Oh, we're getting to it. We're getting to it. Okay? So we said first, we have to understand what he means by hasan. So when a hadith meets these three criteria, he may call it hasan. What about when a hadith meets not just these three conditions, but goes far and beyond that and meets the 5 conditions of sahih? Then we can now call it what? Hasanun sahih. And this is what's meant according to Imam al-Tirmidhi. That not only did it meet his criteria, which are less stringent, but it also met the 5 conditions of authenticity. And this is why he will call it Hasanun Sahih. And this is the best explanation that we've come across when it comes to the phrase Hasanun Sahih. So the hadith, for example, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, not only meets these 3, but it meets these 5. Fahim? Tamam, Jameen. And what you mean is that one of the conditions of Imam al-Tirmidhi is that it must come from multiple paths. Jameen. When we say that a hadith must come from multiple paths, we don't restrict it to actual asanid. What it can mean also is that the meaning of this hadith, for example, is also found in the Quran. It's supported by ayat in the Quran. So Imam al-Tirmidhi will grade a hadith as hasan even if this is the case. Does this answer your question? Okay. So that which supports a hadith is not only additional chains, but we look at the entire Sharia. Okay, we find ayat that talk about intention, right? About seeking the pleasures of Allah, seeking the akhirah, right? Working towards that goal. All of this lends support to the idea of having what? A good intention. All right. So this is what is meant by Hasanun Sahih. He says, وَزِيَادَةُ رَاوِهِمَا مَقْبُولَةٌ مَا لَمْ تَقَعْ مُنَافِيَةً لِمَنْ هُوَ أَوْثَقْ. An addition from a narrator of each of these 2 types of chains, yani Hasan and Sahih, is accepted as long as his addition does not conflict with the report of someone who is more trustworthy. Like, to picture exactly what is meant by this and what the scholars of hadith are referring to here, we have multiple narrators and they're all narrating the same hadith. The asl of the hadith is the same. The foundation of the hadith is the same. Many of them are narrating this. But then there comes a narrator who has an additional wording to the hadith. Okay? Most of the narrators, they stop, there's a period, and then one is narrating with an additional word or 2 to the hadith. The question here is, that reporter who's come with an addition in the hadith which others didn't come with, is it accepted from them? This is what we're looking at here. Okay, this is the question. Is it accepted from them? At times, it's going to be accepted, and at times, it will not be accepted. Okay, this is the approach of the earlier scholars of hadith, even though we find the approach of many who came afterwards, that they accepted these additions mutlaqan. At all times, they would just accept it. Is the narrator authentic? Yes, then we accept it. And they keep moving. But this is not the way of the earlier scholars of hadith. It's not the way of Imam Ahmad and Bukhari and Muslim and An-Nasa'i and others. At times they would accept it, and at times they would reject it. All right? Here, Ibn Ḥajar, he places 2 conditions that must be met in order for us to accept the addition of a narrator. Number 1, he says that this person must be a Hasan or Sahih narrator. Okay? But we will add that it's not just any Hasan or Sahih narrator. And the reason why we're adding this is because he explains this himself in his explanation. All right? Even though it's not mentioned here. This narrator must be a hafiz, an extensive memorizer, and must be a mukthir, known for his extensive narrations. Meaning, he's not someone who narrates just here and there. He's someone who is one of the imams who used to narrate all his life. He's known for narrating. And he's known for deep memorization. This is the type of narrator that we're looking at here, a hafid and mukthir. All right? Someone like Imam Malik, someone like Imam al-Zuhri, someone like Imam Ahmad, someone like Bukhari. They are not equal to some other strong narrator, some other authentic narrator. These are the top of the top. Okay? These are people who we can expect from them that they have something. They have a hadith that's unique to them that others didn't come across. All right? It can be expected from someone like that, but it cannot be expected from any and everyone. The second condition he mentions here is that that report, okay, that hadith they're narrating, it does not oppose, does not conflict or contradict someone who's stronger than them. Someone who is stronger than them. All right? Once these are met, then it's possible that we accept from them. Even then, it doesn't mean we always accept from them. It's very, very strict criteria that must be met. Okay? Even if these criteria are met, we still find the Imams of Hadith rejecting narrations of those who are strong when they come with an addition. Okay? It's very rare that they accept it. To give an example, we have a hadith in Abu Dawood. Okay, the hadith which is reported by Sulaiman ibn Amir, where the Prophet ﷺ, he said, إِذَا أَفْطَرَ أَحَدُكُمْ فَلْيُفْطِرُ عَلَى تَمْرٍ فَإِنَّهُ بَرَكَةٌ فَإِنْ لَمْ يَجِدْ فَلْيُفْطِرْ عَلَى مَاءٍ فَإِنَّهُ طَهُورٌ. When one of you breaks their fast, he should do so with dates because they provide blessing. Okay? And if they cannot get a hold of any, he should break his fast with water because it is purifying. This hadith, it's reported by 9 huffaz, 9 great memorizers. Ibn Uyayna, al-Thawri, Abu Muawiyah, Hammad ibn Zayd, Shu'bah, Ibn Fudayl, Abdurrahim ibn Sulaiman, and Thabit ibn Yazid. 9 of them. But the hadith, it mentions in it to innahu barakah. Okay, because it is a blessing. Only one of these 9 came with that addition, and that is Sufyan ibn Uyayna. And he's hafid, he's an imam, he's mukthir. Yet, it was still not accepted from him. Imam al-Nasa'i rejected this, which shows us that it's not as simple as being a hafid and mukthir. You come with an additional word in the hadith, and there are 9 others conflicting or not saying it, and we accept it from you just because you are trustworthy and not opposing, yani in meaning, others. All right? There are other types of qara'in, other types of external factors that should lend support to this, that should remove this, this worry that we have, that the ulama of hadith, they look at. Okay, those qara'in, we don't need to get into it now, but it's just important to understand. Ibn Ḥajar, he lays these 2 conditions down for a Hasan and Sahih hadith narrator, where we can accept an additional wording they come with. Okay, but also understand that it's not ala al-itlaq, yani every time and all times. Okay, it will still depend on certain external factors that the Imams of hadith, they look at. He says, فَإِنْ خُولِفْ بأرجح فالراجح المحفوظ ومقابله الشاذ ومع ضعف فالراجح المعروف ومقابله المنكر. If the addition is contrary to something superior, yani something stronger, then the stronger one will be what we call mahfuz, well preserved. And its opposite will be called shadh. If in addition to it being contrary or contradictory, it is weak, the stronger one is recognized, yani it's called ma'ruf, and the opposite is called munkar. All right. So here we come across another yani category or categories of hadith. The first one is called shadh. Okay, we're going to break it down. Inshallah, try to make it simple. The first one we come across here is called shadh. The hadith, which is shadh, is when you have a strong narrator, someone who is thiqah, someone who is reliable, yet they're being contradicted by someone who is awthaq, stronger than them. Okay, so you have a strong narrator, but there's a stronger one saying different to him. Or, for example, you have a group of others saying different from him. Just because he's a strong narrator doesn't mean that he's always going to get something right. When we say someone is thiqah, what we mean is the majority of what they narrate is correct. But he's still human at the end of the day. And everyone makes mistakes. And this is one case where we will point out a mistake of his. And we know that by what? Someone stronger than him is saying opposite. Or a group of others are saying opposite. Okay, so we call his narration shadh. It's irregular. Okay? Like, what do we call the narration of this group or of this stronger one? We call that narration mahfuz. We call it mahfuz, that which is well preserved. Okay, so you have shadh and mahfuz. What about the case when the narrator is not a thiqah narrator? He's not a strong narrator. In fact, he's a weak narrator to begin with. And he's being contradicted by someone stronger. Well, now we don't call it shadh anymore. We call it munkar, rejected outright. This is a munkar hadith, where you have a weak narrator to begin with, and someone who is stronger is contradicting him, or a group of others are contradicting him. So you have two case scenarios here, so everyone understands. I'll summarize it again. The first case scenario, you have a strong narrator who's being opposed. We call this shadh. And you have a weak narrator in the second case scenario being opposed. And we call this hadith munkar. Okay, we call it munkar. It is outright rejected. So a reporter may be contradicted in these two ways. He goes on to say, وَالْفَرْضُ النِّسْبِيُّ إِنْ وَافَقَهُ غَيْرُهُ فَهُوَ الْمُتَابِعُ وَإِنْ وُجِدَ مَتْنٌ يُشْبِهُهُ فَهُوَ الشَّاهِدُ وَتَتَبُّعُ الطُّرُقِ لِذَلِكَ هُوَ الْاِعْتِبَارُ. When a report agrees with a fard nisbi, we mentioned fard nisbi yesterday, okay, which is a type of unique report, a solitary report. When a report agrees with a unique report, it is called mutabi', okay, a corroborative chain. When a report's content, the matan, the wording of the hadith, is found, yani when one is found that resembles it, then it is a shahid. It's considered a witness report. And investigating these two types of supports is what we call i'tibar, evaluation. Okay? What does all of this mean? Here, Ibn Ḥajar, he's speaking about those ziyadat of the thiqat that we just mentioned. Okay? The additions, the shadh and the munkar. After he mentioned speaking about that, now he introduces to us some type of research that the ulama of hadith, they engage in. Okay? When it comes to the narrations which are fard, which are solitary reports, which come from a singular path. How do we lift the suspicion off of this type of hadith? Because when a hadith is solitary, when it's unique, there's some suspicion cast upon it. Why is this person or this group of people coming with a hadith that others are not coming with? So this investigation to remove that suspicion is what we're looking at here. Okay? He says there are three different things that are involved. Okay? Number one, that which is called the mutabi'. That which is called the mutabi' or mutaba'at. This is when a reporter, he narrates a hadith. And another person now is found to be narrating from the same shaykh, that hadith. And it leads to the same sahabi. So this person, where it was expected or suspected of one, that he was alone in narrating this hadith, through looking through the hadith and researching, we now find another person who's narrating from the same shaykh, and that hadith leads to the same sahabi. Have we now lifted some doubts from this narrator by finding another one narrating the same thing? Yes. All right. This support that we have just found, we call it a mutabi'. We call it a mutabi'. Okay. And we translate that as a corroborative chain. A chain that is corroborating this one. The second term that he uses here or brings up is what he calls a shahid, a witness report. A shahid. This is when a sahabi, he reports a hadith. Then after searching, we find the same hadith or a hadith with a very similar wording that is being reported by another sahabi. Okay? You have Abu Hurairah. He's saying he heard from the Prophet ﷺ X, Y, and Z. Then you find Anas ibn Malik narrating the same exact thing. Or in its meaning, it's the same. This hadith now of Anas ibn Malik, we call it a shahid, a witness report for the first one. Okay? So mutabi' has to do with the wording of the hadith or the sanad of the hadith. The first one we mentioned. The sanad. The mutaba'at has to do with the chain. We find a corroborative chain. When we're talking about a shahid or shawahid now, it has to do with the wording of the hadith. Okay, the matan. Then he says, al-i'tibar. This investigation that a hadith scholar does to find the mutaba'at and to find the shawahid is called al-i'tibar. In and of its own self is a type of research. Okay, to find the mutaba'at, the corroborative chains, and to find the shawahid, the witness reports, is called al-i'tibar, evaluation. Okay, so these are the three terms that he introduces to us here. And the benefits of the science of i'tibar or evaluation is very clear. In what sense? That it can be used, for example, when you have a hasan hadith, and then now you find a corroborative chain. What happens to that hasan hadith? It's elevated to now what? Sahih lighayrihi, as we mentioned earlier. Okay? Sahih due to external factors. If you did not do al-i'tibar, this evaluation, and find a corroborative chain, you would have never raised that hadith that's hasan now up to sahih. So this is the reasoning behind this particular type of science or research. Okay? طيب. We haven't now even come across a da'if hadith yet. Yani what makes a hadith da'if or not, we haven't mentioned. Okay? Or we haven't looked at specifically. We're still now discussing a hadith that is maqbool, sahih and hasan. Just because a hadith is sahih or hasan, does it now mean that we are to act on this hadith? What do you all say? Do we act on a hadith just because it's sahih or hasan? Yes? We'll see, inshallah. All right. In the next few lines, this is what Ibn Ḥajar he's going to clarify. He says, ثُمَّ الْمَقْبُولِ. As for the accepted ahadith, meaning hasan and sahih. إِن سَلِمَ مِنَ الْمُعَارَضَةِ فَهُوَ الْمُحْكَمِ. If it is free from contradiction or objection, then it is considered muhkam, decisive. وإن عُرِض بمثله فإن أمكن الجمع فمختلف الحديث. if it is contradicted by something equal to it, if reconciliation is possible, they are reconcilable reports. أو لا, and if not, وثبت المتأخر فهو الناسخ. If not, and the later one is positively established, then one is the abrogated report, and the other is the, or abrogating report, and the other is the abrogated report. All of this we'll mention line by line. Don't worry. وإلا فالترجيح ثم التوقف. And if not, then preference is sought, and if not, neither one is confirmed or denied. From the maqbul ahadith, the acceptable ahadith, meaning hasan and sahih, we will have that which is meant to be acted upon and that which is not meant to be acted upon. Okay, this is the summary of it. You will find ahadith which are authentic, yes, there's no doubt about it, but it's not meant for us to be acted upon for one reason or another. Okay, so we'll look at some of those reasons. The first thing that he mentions here is that if the hadith is free from any type of opposition or contradiction, if it is a sahih hadith or hasan hadith, and there's nothing that is going against it, then it is what we call muhkam. It is a decisive, you act upon it. Okay? It's called muhkam. This is a hadith that we act upon. There's no problems here. طيب, what if the hadith is opposed to something that is equal to it in strength? To something that is equal to it in strength. Okay? Meaning that hadith that is maqbool is found to go against another hadith that is maqbool. Sahih and sahih. Or hasan and hasan. The same grading. And yet they are completely contradicting each other apparently. Okay? How do we approach this? He gives the first approach here. Okay? There will be either one of two scenarios. The first scenario is that we approach it by that which is called al-jam'. We harmonize between both reports. There's a way that we can accept both. There's a way to make sense of both. All right? If you can make sense of both, then you take both. And this is what we call jam'. Okay? You harmonize. And this harmonization, he says, is called Muṣṭalaḥ al-Hadīth. This is the science. Okay, this is a stand-alone science within hadith called Muṣṭalaḥ al-Hadīth. Entire books have been written on it, where the author compiles a book of seemingly outwardly contradicting a hadith and how to reconcile them, how to make sense of them. Okay, this science is called Muṣṭalaḥ al-Hadīth. So the first way is that we do jam', we harmonize between both. For example, we have the authentic hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, he says, "La adwa wa la tiyara." There is no such thing as contagious diseases and no evil omens. Yani there's not a disease that's contagious, nor is there an evil omen. Yani nothing evil can befall you. But then we also have another authentic hadith from the Prophet ﷺ himself, where he says, "Firra min al-majdumi kama tafirru min al-asadi." Flee, run away from, stay far away from the leper, the person who has leprosy, the same way you would avoid a lion. Hinting towards what? That there's some type of contagion, some type of contagious disease. Like the first hadith says there is none, and the second says there is, or points to the fact that there is. Seemingly these are contradictory, but in reality they're not. As a result, we do what? Jam', we harmonize between both. And the ulama, they point out that what's meant is there is no contagious disease in and of itself. Yani the contagion, the disease cannot do anything to you except by the will of Allah. This is what's meant. At the same time, you take your precautions. You tie your camel. But you believe and you know internally that none can truly harm you, that nothing can actually hit you except by the will of Allah. Tamam? So this is how you make what? Jam' between the two ahadith. Okay, so when the two ahadith are seemingly contradictory, this is the first approach that we take. We do jam', we harmonize. Like, what if we cannot do that? What if they're contradictory? There's no way to do jam'. There's no way to harmonize between both. He gives the second approach or the second option that we take. Okay, and that is we look at if one of the hadith is considered nasikh, meaning abrogated, it's cancelled. Okay, or a hadith has now come to cancel it out. Okay, the one that is cancelled is called mansukh. The one that's abrogated is called mansukh. And the one that is doing the abrogation or the cancellation is called the nasikh. Okay? This is the second approach that we take. And we have, for example, the hadith of Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu, where the Prophet ﷺ, he says, إِنِّي كُنْتُ نحيتكم عن زيارة القبور فزوروها فإنها تذكركم الآخرة. The Prophet ﷺ, he says in the hadith, and this hadith, it shows that a previous ruling is now cancelled. The Prophet ﷺ, he says, I used to forbid you from going to the cemeteries, from visiting the cemeteries. فَزُورُوهَا, now you may go and visit, because it will remind you of the akhirah. Meaning there's a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ used to do what? Related to this? Nahi, he used to forbid it. But now there comes a hadith which is allowing it. So if one were to look at the hadith, okay, this hadith is allowing it and this one's not, they might say there's a contradiction. But in reality, there's not. Because this one is now abrogated, it's cancelled, it is mansukh. Because a nasikh, an abrogator has come. Okay, so there's no contradiction there. If we cannot do jam', harmonize, then we move on to what? Nasikh and mansukh. One is now cancelled completely. And one stands as the hadith that we are to act upon. Okay? طيب. What if even this is not possible? What if this is not even possible? Yani, there's no way to tell that this one is nasikh and mansukh. Now we move on to something else, and that is to give tarjih. We exercise. And by we, I don't mean us. Yani, we mean the mujtahideen, the imams of hadith. They exercise their knowledge, their specialty, their experience in giving preference to one over the other. Okay? And then this is not based off of one's hawa, one's desires. I prefer this one over the other. La. But because one is stronger than the other in their eyes due to certain reasons. Okay, and we'll give an example to make it clear. We have one hadith which is reported by Anas ibn Malik radiallahu anhu, where he says that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam تزوج ميمونة وهو محرم. He married Maymuna while he was a muhrim, yani in ihram, the state of ihram. Okay? He was in Umrah. He married Maymuna while he was in the state of ihram. Then we have another hadith, and this is the hadith of Maymuna, where she says, or explains that the Prophet ﷺ تزوجها وهو حلال. The Prophet ﷺ married her while he was halal, meaning outside of the state of ihram. No longer performing the rituals. He was already outside. He already exited the rituals of Umrah. You have two seemingly contradictory ahadith. You cannot make jam' between them. The Prophet ﷺ could not have married her while he was in ihram and while he was out of ihram. It doesn't work. There's no indicators here of showing nasikh and mansukh. He cannot marry her twice. He married her here and then married her there. So what do we move on to now? Giving preference of one over the other. Here, the ulama, they give preference to which one? The second one. Why? Because the hadith is about Maymuna and she's describing it herself. Whereas the first one is coming from Anas. So does it make more sense to take the hadith about someone from someone else, or about themselves narrating it? From themselves. They know themselves better. She knows when she was married by the Prophet ﷺ, if he was in ihram or not. So we put aside the hadith of Anas in this case, and we give preference to the hadith of Maymuna herself. She's narrating it about herself. So this we call tarjih. We call this tarjih, giving preference to one over the other. طيب, what if even that is not possible? None of these are possible. It's not muhkam. We cannot do jam'. We cannot find if one is nasikh and mansukh. We cannot give tarjih, preference. What do we do after that? Ibn Ḥajar, he says, ثُمَّ التَّوَقُّفِ. We put our hands up like this and we pause on that narration. Let another imam come and he'll solve it. He'll figure it out. And this is very unique and rare. I've never come across a hadith like this, where we pause upon it. Okay? But these are the stages and the ways that we approach a hadith, and it must be done in this order. It's not optional that you jump to one before the other. It must be done in this order. Because the asl is what? That we accept the hadith before you move on to the next stages. All right? ثم المردود, he says, then the rejected reports. إما أن يكون لسقط أو طعن. فالسقط إما أن يكون من مبادئ السند من مصنف أو من آخره بعد التابع أو غير ذلك. Then the rejected report, it will either be due to a break in the chain or criticism of the reporter. As for the break, the saqt, then it will occur either at the beginning of the chain or towards its end near the tabi'i, or other than that. Ibn Ḥajar, he highlights for us here that there are two major reasons, two overall reasons that a hadith will be considered weak or rejected. What are those two reasons he mentions here? Number one, there is a break in the chain. Or number two, there is some type of criticism. There is some type of criticism. طيب. When you have these two, these are connected to which ones of the 5 conditions of authenticity? The first one, a break in the chain, is opposite of what? It being connected. What about a criticism? Which one is that connected to? Huh? Adl? Huh? Adala and Dabt? All of them. All of the remaining. Because if we say adala and dabt only, then that means what? A hadith can have shudud and illah? La. Okay? So when we say criticism, we mean criticism of the narrator's memory. We mean criticism of the narrator's integrity. When we say criticism, we mean criticism of the wording of the hadith. It may have a hidden defect or a abnormality. Okay? So these two cover all 5 of the conditions of authenticity. These are two overall reasons, as we mentioned, that a hadith will now be considered mardud, rejected, all right, or da'if. طيب. And each one of these criticisms will have its own term that we need to define. Each one will have its own term. The chain being broken. Depending on where the chain is broken, throughout the life cycle of the chain, it will have a specific term. And depending on the type of criticism, whether that criticism is aimed at the wording of the hadith or aimed at the narrator, it will have a specific term that we use. All right? And he's going to mention each one of these one by one. He says, فَالْأَوَّلُ الْمُعَلَّقُ وَالثَّانِي الْمُرْسَلُ والثالث إن كان باثنين فصاعدا مع التوالي فهو المعضل وإلا فالمنقطع. The first one. What does he mean by the first one? Ah.
Beginning of the sanad.
Huh?
Beginning of the sanad.
Beginning of the sanad. Yani when there's a break at the beginning of the sanad. Okay, when there's a break at the beginning of the sanad, what we mean by this is from the perspective of the one narrating it. Okay, what usually comes to the mind when we say beginning of the sanad is what? From the part of where? The Prophet ﷺ. That's not what's meant here. What's meant here is from the person narrating it onwards, from their side. Okay, that the chain is broken from them. So, for example, Bukhari, he narrates a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ. This is called what? Mu'allaq, because he does not mention the full chain between him and the Prophet ﷺ. If he were to do that, yani this is just an example. If Bukhari says the Prophet ﷺ said, well, Bukhari passed away in 256 after Hijrah. That's many years after the Prophet ﷺ. There's no way he heard directly from him. So if he doesn't mention the sanad from himself onward, then this type of break or gap is called mu'allaq. Okay, mu'allaq. And we will sometimes find this type of hadith where there's a huge gap. And this is automatically considered what? A weak narration. A weak narration. Okay, because the chain, the entire chain, or most of it is missing. All right, so when it starts from the side of the person narrating it, it's considered a mu'allaq report. All right. Taban, nowadays, this is not necessarily something that applies. Okay, we're talking about a hadith that have been narrated, and when someone is researching a hadith to grade them. But nowadays, for example, let's say someone is given a khutbah. Does anyone mention a hadith with the full chain from themselves onward? La. Okay, this is also considered mu'allaq, but in that case, we're not considering whether it's authentic or not, because the hadith can be found where? In Bukhari or Muslim or some other compilation where it's already been graded and the chain exists. Okay, we're talking about when a chain actually doesn't exist. Okay, or for example, someone opens up Riyadh al-Salihin or al-Arba'un al-Nawawiyah. Do these books of hadith have chains in them? Have you ever looked in them? Or does it just say Abu Hurairah said, the Prophet said? Does Imam al-Nawawi, who came in the 8th, 7th century, narrate with his full chain to the Prophet? No, this is called mu'allaq. But in that case also doesn't really mean anything because those ahadith actually have asanid in the books of hadith. All right. But when you find a hadith that actually does not have a chain, then we call it mu'allaq, and it is da'if. The second, he says, وَالثَّانِي al-mursal. The second type is considered mursal. And what is the second type? When the hadith is broken from where? From the area of the tabi'i, he says. Now the complete other side of the chain. Okay? From the tabi'i's area. Meaning what? The tabi'i is saying, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. The Prophet ﷺ said. And why is this an issue? A tabi'i, by definition, he never met the Prophet ﷺ. Right? By definition. Otherwise, he would be a what? Sahabi. So now you have a tabi'i saying, قال Rasulullah, the Prophet ﷺ said, without mentioning who he got it from. This is also considered a break. Someone is missing, or some persons are missing. It could be another tabi'i from a sahabi, from the Prophet ﷺ, or it could be just a sahabi from the Prophet ﷺ. It depends. All right? But this too is considered a weakness, although it's lighter than the first, which is called mu'allaq, which is missing an entire chain. Okay? This one is closer to the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and it's maybe missing one or two people. Okay? So it's lighter in weakness, yet at the end of the day, it's still considered a weakness. All right? The third one, he says, إن كان باثنين فصاعدا مع التوالي فهو معضل. When the hadith has a break that is consecutive with two or more people, meaning back-to-back breaks, with two or more people, then this is called mu'dal. The ulama, they call this the mu'dal hadith. All right. Mu'dal is at times used in more than one sense by the scholars of hadith. At times, it is used, and this is the majority usage, is how he's defining it here. That a hadith has a break in its chain, and at least two people are missing back to back. This is how they usually use the term. But you will also find the ulama of hadith using this term to refer to a hadith which are batil, rejected outright, fabricated. All right, even if they have a connected chain. It's important to know when they're using it to mean this and that. Okay. طيب. An example of where we will find a hadith which are mu'dal in the sense that Ibn Ḥajar is explaining to us here is what we will often find in the Muwaṭṭa of Imam Malik. Okay, Imam Malik, he has a hadith which we call balaghat, the balaghat narrations. And that's because he narrates these by saying balaghani, it has reached me. Okay, balaghani anna Aba Hurayra qala kada wa kada. It has reached me that Abu Huraira said such and such. And this is the issue. Why again? He's not mentioning the chain. He's only saying it has reached me from Abu Huraira. طيب, from who? When the ulama follow up these narrations, they would find that there is at least minimum between Imam Malik and Abu Huraira. How many? Two consecutive people, back to back. All right. Imam Malik, he heard from مثلا الزهري from al-A'raj from Abu Huraira. There's at least two people that are narrating or missing in the chain, okay, consecutively. So this is what we call a mu'dal hadith. Then he goes on to say, or he said, وَإِلَّا فَالْمُنْقَطِعُ. Like, what if there's a break in the chain, but it's not consecutive? It's not back to back. It's not in the beginning and it's not in the end. It's just somewhere in the middle. This type of hadith is called, or break is called, munqati'. This type of break is called munqati'. All right. This refers to a narration where someone is missing in the middle of the chain. Okay. But it can also be used to refer to a break in the chain in general. Umuman. Okay. You'll find the ulama of hadith using it both ways. When a hadith has a break in the middle, that's not back to back, they'll call it munqati'. But you will also find them using this term to refer to any break in the chain, meaning a mu'dal hadith can also be called munqati'. A mursal hadith can also be called munqati'. A mu'allaq hadith, which doesn't have a chain to begin with, can also be called munqati' in general. This is just referring to a break in the chain. Okay. But you'll find them, as we said, using it both ways. All right. ثم قد يكون واضحا أو خفيا. He says these breaks will occur either being obvious or being hidden. فالأول يدرك بعدم التلاقي ومن ثم احتيج إلى التاريخ. The first is obvious, an obvious break is recognized by a lack of meeting one another, and hence it requires some biographical history or information. All right. So he's saying here that the break in the chain, at times it will be clear as day to spot and to recognize. At other times, it will be a little bit more difficult to realize that there's a break that has occurred in the chain. In that case, you need some information having to do with biography to help you determine that a break has occurred. Okay, to help you determine that a break has occurred. Fadl.
Is there a term for hadith that's munqati' in two different places, not back to back?
That's still called munqati'. Still called munqati'. Okay. He says, طيب, والثاني المدلس ويرد بصيغة تحمل اللقي كعن وقال وكذا المرسل الخفي من معاصر لم يلقى. The second is the concealed reports. The concealed reports. The mudallas reports. A report which is passed on with a phrase which implies possible meaning, such as an, from so and so. Or qala, he said. Likewise, the hidden broken report, mursal khafi, from a contemporary he did not meet. And all of this we will explain. All right. Here we're looking at the mudallas hadith. The mudallas hadith. Okay. And it's called mudallas because what occurs in it? Something that is called tadlis, a concealment. Okay. Tadlis refers to something being concealed. Dallasa refers to something that's hidden in the dark. Okay. Tadlis is the narration where something is being concealed or covered. That narration is called the mudallas narration. The one who is doing that concealment is called the mudallis. Okay? The one who's doing the concealment is called the mudallis. Tamam? This is describing, as we mentioned, a narrator. Here he's intentionally giving the impression that he heard a hadith from a shaykh, though he did not hear that hadith from the shaykh. Intabih. We said he's giving the impression. Technically, he's not what? Lying. Technically, he's not lying. He's using a phrase which, to the person listening, sounds like he took the hadith from that shaykh directly. All right? This is what's meant by tadlis here, when he's concealing who he's getting the narration from. What are those phrases that he's using in order to give the impression? One of those phrases is an so and so, from so and so. Or he says qala so and so said. Here he's giving the impression he heard from the shaykh. But did he say he heard from the shaykh? No. Because if he said it, then that would be considered what? A lie. Okay? This is a type of break in the chain which is clear or a bit hidden. It's a bit hidden. All right? There's a break that has occurred. Otherwise, it wouldn't be considered tadlis. All right? There's a break that has occurred. But it's a bit difficult to spot it. All right? It's a bit difficult to spot it. طيب. What happens now? Before we move on, in the case of tadlis, this narrator who's taking from this shaykh is actually known to be a student of this shaykh. He is actually known to have studied with this shaykh. But when we say tadlis is occurring here, we're referring to this particular what? Narration. All right? Not every single narration. So tadlis has to do with when a person, yes, they have met each other. They do know each other. In fact, this student is known to be a student of this shaykh. But in this case, where tadlis is occurring, we say, in this case, he did not hear the hadith. Instead, he heard it from someone else who heard from the shaykh. And this occurs, for example, someone who was here yesterday for our class may not be here today. Now, that person, he comes to one of you brothers who was present and says, tell me something that was said in the class. And so you tell them, Dursa said so and so, or such and such. Then when they go on to narrate it, they don't say that they got it from you, who got it from me. They just say, Dursa said, instead of mentioning who they got it from. Did they lie? No. But it may have given the impression that they heard it directly from me, even though they're not present here today. And even though we know that they are someone who may usually attend the classes, and was in fact here yesterday. All right. We did meet. We have sat with each other. He did hear from me before, but in the second case, he did not. All right. Like, what about the case now where there are two people? They live in the same time period. They may even live in the same city. They may have even crossed paths. And now one is narrating from the other, but he never even heard the hadith from that person. Do we see the two differences here? The first one, they're known to have met. The second one, they're not known to have met. Which one is more difficult to spot? One that is known to have met. The second one now is called Mursal al-Khafi. Okay, it's a type of Mursal hadith that's Khafi, as the scholars they call. Okay, Mursal Khafi. It's a more hidden type of Mursal hadith. Mursal, why? Because they're close to each other in the time period. Just like in the Mursal hadith we've already mentioned, the Tabi'i is close to the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, here we're talking about two people who are contemporary at the same time. So from that angle, it's Mursal, but it's even more hidden. Okay, it's even more hidden than the Tabi'i narrating from the Prophet ﷺ. Tamam? He says, ثُمَّ الطَّعْنُ. ثُمَّ الطَّعْنُ. Remember, we began this section of rejected ahadith, of mardud ahadith, by saying that there are two general reasons why a hadith is rejected. Those two are what? That the chain is either broken or there's some type of what? Criticism. Okay? We've touched on the different breaks in the chain. A hadith is mu'allaq, a hadith is mursal, a hadith is mu'dal, etc. And where those breaks occur. We're done with the first overall reason that a hadith is considered weak, which is the break in the chain. Now we move on to the criticism. The second reason that a hadith may be considered weak or rejected. Okay? He says, ثُمَّ الطَّعْنُ إِمَّا أَنْ يَكُونَ لِكَذِبِ الرَّاوِي. Either it will be due to the narrator lying, أو تُحْمَتِهِ بِذَلِكَ, or being accused of it, أو فُحْشَ غَلَطِهِ, or him making enormous mistakes, أو غفلته, or him being heedless, أو فسقه, or him being morally corrupt, أو مخالفته, or him being delusionary, his narrations are completely conflicted or opposed, أو جهالته, or him being unknown, أو بدعته, or due to his innovation, أو سوء حفظه, or due to his poor memory. Ibn Ḥajar here, he mentions for us 10 reasons that criticism is labeled. Okay, 10 reasons that a criticism are labeled. 5 of them have to do with the morality of the person. Okay, 5 of them have to do with the memorization of the person. Even though he doesn't mention here the 5 having to do with memory and then the 5 having to do with the person's integrity, he doesn't mention it like that. They're kind of all over the place. But the reason why is because he's mentioning it from worst to least worst. Okay, the worst one is at top, and then it drops down in that which is less than the one above it. Okay, what are those? He says the first one, فَالْأَوَّلُ الْمَوْضُوعُ. The first type of criticism is called mawdu'. What is the first criticism? When the narrator is what? A liar. When the narrator is a liar, that hadith that he's narrating is now going to be called mawdu', fabricated. Okay? It's going to be called fabricated. Kadhib al-rawi, or the narrator or reporter lying, is when he is clearly narrating something that is the Prophet ﷺ, that is not from the words of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay? Meaning it's makdhub, it's a type of lie that has been placed on Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And a kadhab or a kadhib, in the definition of the scholars, is that person who is reporting بخلاف الواقع, in opposition to something that's reality. Okay? And this is the case, it's important to understand, whether they are intending that or not intending that. Al-Muhim, they are narrating something that is not true, that the Prophet ﷺ did not say. Yes, if someone's intending it, we'll deal with his narrations different than someone who did not intend it. La shak. However, at the end of the day, this one is saying something that the Prophet ﷺ did not say, and this one is also saying something that the Prophet ﷺ did not say. We'll give you an example. In day-to-day life, real life, for example, someone commits a crime. He robs someone and he kills them. This person, he intended murder. Now you have another person who's driving, may Allah protect us, and he, by mistake, unintentionally, hits someone and kills them. This one intended the murder. This one didn't. At the end of the day, there's still a what? A person dead. Sahulala. The natija, the conclusion at the end is the same. So when it comes to the field of hadith, we don't busy ourselves with the person's intent, usually. This one didn't intend it. This one intended it. At the end of the day, they're both coming with something that's considered a lie. The Prophet ﷺ did not say this or do this. Okay? And we will often find a lot of the righteous people narrating ahadith which are makdhuba, rejected, mawdu'a, fabricated. Shaykh Ibn Abdullah al-Qadi, a scholar of hadith, he was once in a majlis and he was giving a hadith lesson. When he narrated a hadith to his students, okay, he was reporting, he said, we were told by an al-A'mash, who heard from Abu Salih, who heard from Abu Hurairah. Then he paused, waiting for his students to write down the chain. Al-A'mash from Abu Salih from Abu Hurairah, before he tells them what the Prophet ﷺ said. Then in walked in Abu Musa al-Zahid, a righteous man. And this scholar, Shaykh ibn Abdullah al-Qadi, he looked up at him and he said, Man kathura salatuhu bil-layl ibyadda wajhuhu bin-nahar. He said, the one who's frequent in his night prayers, then during the daytime, his face is very bright. Referring to Abu Musa al-Zahid. Abu Musa, he heard this hadith. Then he went on later on to say, I heard from Shaykh ibn Abdullah al-Qadi, who heard from al-A'mash, who heard from Abi Salih, who heard from Abu Hurairah, that the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever has night prayers, a lot of night prayers, then in the daytime his face is bright. Shaykh ibn Abdullah al-Qadi was referring to him. He wasn't telling a hadith. Abu Musa al-Zahid is a righteous man. Yeah, he came with what type of hadith? Complete fabrication. The Prophet ﷺ did not say this. Was that his intention? It wasn't his intention. But it's still a mawdu' hadith. Na'am, as we said previously. We're going to deal with his narrations differently than we deal with the narrations of someone who intends it. The one who intends it, we're never accepting his ahadith again. Because he intended to lie. But the one who doesn't intend it, we reject that hadith. But we may still accept from him other ahadith. Tamam? So when a hadith is fabricated, this is how we approach it. And it's called mawdu'. Okay, it's called mawdu'. At times, the hadith will be proven to be mawdu' from the narrator himself. He'll admit it. We have examples of that. Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, he mentions that once there was a zandiq, a heretic. And by zandiq we mean someone who makes it his job to try to corrupt the religion. He's often involved in controversies. You find him on YouTube, always coming with a new video, saying something that is throwing everyone off, coming with a view that no one has said before him. This man's intent is to cause some type of corruption in the religion. Once Harun al-Rashid, he caught a hold of a zindiq, and he was going to execute him. He was going to execute him. When this man, he said, أين أنت من ألف حديث وضعتها? Where are you in regards to the 1,000 ahadith I fabricated? Harun, you need me alive. You want to know which ahadith I fabricated? You need me alive. Harun al-Rashid, he said, no problem. We have Abdullahi al-Fazari and Abdullah ibn Mubarak, or we have al-Fazari and Abdullah ibn Mubarak. They are going to sift through each narration harfan harfa, letter by letter. And he executed him anyways. Why? Because we have those imams who are memorizers, who are specialists in this field. They'll be able to smell out which is a fabrication and which. All right. And the people throughout history, they fabricated a hadith for various reasons. One of them is this, as we mentioned, in order to cause corruption. At times, it may have been for money. And you have these people who tell stories, these storytellers. Once in Baghdad, a man, he stood up in the masjid after the prayer and he began to narrate a hadith. Why? At the end, so he can collect donations. He stood up and he said, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal and Yahya ibn Ma'in, they narrated to me. Whoever says La ilaha illallah, then he will get this many trees in paradise. And each tree has this many branches. And this branch has this many jewels, and etc., etc. And he went on and on. Who was in the audience? Ahmad ibn Hanbal and Yahya ibn Ma'in. And they're looking at each other. Did you tell him this? And each one is saying no. Then they went up to him afterwards and they said, where did you hear this hadith from? He says, Yahya ibn Ma'in and Ahmad ibn Hanbal. And Yahya says, I'm Yahya ibn Ma'in, and this is Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and this is the first we're ever hearing this. And the man doubles down. And he says, you know, I heard Yahya ibn Ma'in was a little off. Do you think you're the only Yahya ibn Ma'in? And he's the only Ahmad ibn Hanbal? And he tried to get away with it like this. Al-Muhim, this man's intent at the end of it was to collect money. So they used to tell people fancy ahadith, interesting ahadith, which they're making up from their own selves for the purpose of collecting money. Another reason is ta'assub. This exists also. Partisanship, according to one's madhab, for example. Someone's a fanatic. This man wants to follow the Shafi'i madhab. He's a Shafi'i, no matter what. This one's a Hanafi, no matter what. To the extent that they would do what? Fabricate a hadith against one another. This one comes and he says that the Prophet ﷺ, he said, there will come in my ummah. Yani this is an actual fabricated hadith. There will come in my ummah a man by the name of Nu'man ibn Thabit. Huwa siraju ummati. He is the shining lamp of my ummah. Nu'man ibn Thabit is who? Abu Hanifa. And then there will come a man by the name of Muhammad ibn Idris. Fitnatuhu, his fitna, is more severe on this ummah than that of Iblis. Muhammad ibn Idris is a Shafi'i. And due to extreme partisanship, they would make up a hadith against one another. At times, the intent might have even been good, even though still not accepted. You have, for example, a sect of the past, which was called al-Karramiyya. And they would say, نكذب له لا نكذب عليه. We lie for the Prophet ﷺ, not against him. Meaning they would make up ahadith which, according to them, are to bring people close to the religion. Making up ahadith, for example, whoever reads this surah of the Quran, he'll get this type of reward. Their intent being what? That a person picks up the mushaf and does what? Read. The intent may have been good, but it's still rejected. And it's still considered mawdu'. Still considered mawdu'. Tamam? We'll end by mentioning just some famous or well-known ahadith which happen to be fabricated. And one we mentioned yesterday, which was the hadith of seeking knowledge, even if it takes you as far as where? China. Okay? This is fabricated. Another is a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ is quoted to have said that the ink of the scholar is holier than the blood of the martyr. This too is a fabricated hadith according to Khatib al-Baghdadi. Another hadith is the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, he was coming from jihad, from a expedition, from a battle. And he says to his Sahaba, we have now come from the lesser jihad to the greater jihad. Meaning the jihad al-nafs, the struggle against the desire. This too is fabricated. And everyone goes through the struggles of the desire every day. But not everyone goes through what? The swords clashing above his head. All right. Another weak hadith, or not weak hadith, but fabricated hadith, is where a famous story where the Prophet ﷺ, he had a Jewish neighbor. And this Jewish neighbor used to do what every single day? Leave some type of harmful objects or garbage at his doorstep. And the Prophet ﷺ would remain patient and not do anything. This is a hadith, actually, it's not even found in the books of hadith. Forget about it being mentioned and not having a chain. It's not even found. Okay? This is a complete fabrication. And it makes one wonder who came up with such a report and for what reason. All right? These are some ahadith which are fabricated. And again, this is the first type of criticism that Ibn Ḥajar, he brings here out of how many? 10. The rest of the criticisms, inshallah, we'll pick up tomorrow. نكتفي بهذا القدر. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. جزاكم الله خيرا والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.